Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Group Certification: How to Provide Efficient and Effective Assurance of Good Agricultural Practices to Grower Groups. My name is Tegan Versolato, and I'll be your X-Talks moderator for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, with time for a question and answer session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. The chat box is located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for future download. At this point, I'd like to thank GLOBALG.A.P, who helped develop the content for this presentation. Good Agricultural Practices certification covering food safety is a retail requirement for fruit and vegetable producers in the USA and beyond. Historically, G.A.P certification has been out of reach for many small and mid-sized farms, largely because of price. Group certification is an alternative offered by multiple certification programs, wherein grower groups can share the certification costs by pooling together. However, some wonder how a certification that does not require annual external audits of every farm can provide adequate assurance. To answer this question, featured speakers will explore GLOBALG.A.P certification system for producer groups, a certificate accepted by retailers worldwide, to understand how efficient and effective group certification works. Under this options, farmers must have an internal management and control system, perform individual self-inspections, and group internal inspections before receiving an external verification by a certification body. With the right controls in place, a group certification can deliver the assurance that parallels individual G.A.P certification. To provide a brief overview of the group certification process, GLOBALG.A.P has included a video that will be playing on your screen shortly. Enjoy.
Today, more and more markets demand certification from producers. This, however, can be a challenge for some producers. Smallholder producers, for example, might find it difficult due to a lack of sufficient resources, technical expertise, and funds. Also, they compete with commercial producers in terms of volume of product and market access. Larger individual producers, on the other hand, are also striving to establish a stronger marketing strategy, and high input costs is also a concern for them. A possible solution for producers is the GLOBALG.A.P Option 2 Producer Group Certification. At present, more than 2/3 of the GLOBALG.A.P certified producers are organized in producer groups, and this option has successfully been used for already more than 10 years. Producers, small or large, can form a producer group, whereby they jointly sell their products to defined markets. In terms of GLOBALG.A.P, Option 2 Producer Group Certification refers to a group of producers with a shared mandatory quality management system, QMS. The QMS will, in short, cover, among others, topics such as document control, internal QMS audit and internal producer inspections, non-compliances, corrective actions, and sanctions, product traceability and segregation. The implementation of a QMS is obligatory and a key element in group certification. The QMS ensures consistency and improvement of working practices, which in turn provide products and services that meet customers' requirements. The group of producers must have an internal procedure where 100% of the registered members are internally inspected according to the GLOBALG.A.P requirements, and a management representative with ultimate responsibility. The role of the certification body is not to determine the compliance of each producer in the group, but rather to assess whether the group's internal controls are appropriate. As certain activities are managed centrally, the inspection time on farm level is shorter, and this can save on the certification costs. A GLOBALG.A.P approved certification body will conduct an announced audit of the QMS and select and inspect, on short notice and at random, the square root of the total number of producers that are included in this group. 10% of producer groups shall also be selected for an unannounced audit. Each producer member of a group receives its own Global Gap number, GGN, but only one certificate is issued to the entire group after a successful external audit of the QMS and random sample inspections of the producers by a Global Gap approved certification body. The members of the group are included in the annex of the Global Gap certificate. Group certification aims to reduce non-conformances to food safety and quality issues and customers' expectations in the most cost-effective and efficient manner. Benefits for producers include save time and money, improve customer satisfaction, better quality products, improve internal process, create easier access to markets. Global Gap Option 2 certification, when appropriately managed, is a strong and robust system and is accepted by a large number of buyers globally. When overall compared with individual certification, it is a more cost-effective solution, especially due to the effective sampling formula. Our certification integrity program also ensures that the internal and sampling processes are correctly implemented, making it a trustworthy system. For more information about Option 2, please contact Global Gap at info@globalgap.org.
And for further clarification on the group certification process, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for today's event, Roberta Anderson. Roberta heads the areas of business development and marketing and is responsible for operations, managing staff, overseeing the annual budget, and planning processes to achieve Global Gap's goal of being the preferred solution provider for farm assurance in North America. She joined Global Gap in 2015 and has built her career working with certification programs, marketing, and business development in agriculture and food systems. She holds a BSc in International Agricultural and National Resources from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and an MBA in Business, Food Industry Management, and Sustainability from Portland State University. Our second speaker for today is Roberta Anderson. Roberta is Global Gap's technical expert from the North American marketplace, overseeing training, managing Global Gap's National Technical Working Group, and supporting Global Gap certification bodies and farm assurers. She serves as Global Gap North America's technical liaison with the integrity and standards development teams in Cologne. Roberta joined GGNA in October 2016 and is a former certification body scheme manager with experience in training, auditing, orchard and dairy management, greenhouse production, and food service. She has a BSc in Agricultural Science from California Polytechnic State University. And our final speaker for today's webinar is Amanda May. Amanda has been the California Farming Food Safety Manager for Wonderful Citrus since 2012. She is responsible for the Global Gap Option 2 implementation and maintenance for 50,000 acres. Her work also includes supplier compliance with FSMA Sanitary Transportation Rule, FSVP, and Produce Safety Rule. Amanda is a member of the Global Gap National Technical Working Group and United Fresh Food Safety and Technology Council. She's an alumnus of California State University, San Luis Obispo, with a BS in agribusiness. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for today, Roberta. And Roberta, you may take over whenever you are ready. Go right ahead.
Thank you very much. Rebecca, please go ahead and put the slides up. Thank you. So I hope that video was a good snapshot for all of you of what we're going to be talking about today. The agenda is that we're going to start with just an introduction to the concept of group certification, and then we're going to dive a little bit into Global Gap's system for group certification as an example. We will explore the certification options that Global Gap offers. We will explain the requirements for a Global Gap Quality Management System, or QMS, and we will also explain the assessment process, which includes registration, assessment, and certification. And then ultimately, we will review a case study presented by Amanda May for Wonderful Citrus. She will be able to share a little bit more about what she does for Wonderful Citrus and how that ties into a Global Gap group certification for their operations. So the first question really is, why is group certification needed in the first place? We all are aware that good agricultural practices certification is favored in the marketplace. We see it as industry best practice, and it's also a full requirement by many buyers, particularly in fresh fruit and vegetable supply chains. So what we find is that, you know, individual certification can be out of reach for small farms. It can be out of reach because of the cost of having audits and the cost of getting those reports, and also just the compliance burden of designing and maintaining a full food safety and environmental and social system for managing in your farm. So there, in addition to those limitations, there's a limitation of availability of external auditors. External auditors are required to have significant education, experience, and training in order to be auditors. Oftentimes, their schedules are very busy at certain parts of the year. So just in being able to deploy external auditors to do audits on farm can be challenging, especially at the busiest times of the year. So, so there is that consideration as well. So what is group certification? And just simply, it's the concept that grower groups can pool together. You can imagine this working for cooperatives, for example, or other groups of growers who share a lot of their production systems and the products in common. So growers and grower groups will share internal management systems. We at GLOBAL.G.A.P refer to quality management system, but this internal management system is the function to hold their practices together. The group shares the cost of certification as well. So it shares the cost in terms of some of the implementation. It shares the cost in terms of auditing and reports, and also certification fees. Individual certification requirements can be duplicative for groups that have this type of internal control system. It can be duplicative because those individuals may share risk assessments. Those individuals may have in common policies. So if it can be done in a centralized way, that improves efficiency significantly. So if you, you know, we've talked so far, we're going to be focusing on GLOBAL.G.A.P's certification program for groups, for grower groups, but I do want to point out that this is broadly used in the industry for food and also for forestry. So, for example, the USDA's AMS, Agricultural Marketing Services, uses it for have a group GAP certification option. We can look to SQF also. There are a couple of aquaculture certification programs that use a group certification. Rainforest Alliance and I believe Fair Trade offers group certification. So all of their systems may be a little bit different, but I think that you'll find that a lot have in common some of the core principles that Rebecca is going to be sharing with you when she talks about GLOBAL.G.A.P in depth. So moving on to our illustration through GLOBAL.G.A.P, you'll be hearing us refer to something called Option 2, which is what we speak of for our group certification. GLOBAL.G.A.P itself is it sets worldwide standards for assuring good agricultural practices. So our objective is really safe, sustainable agriculture worldwide. We set voluntary standards for certification, and we also do work to harmonize and benchmark with other certification standards to streamline certification globally. Our purpose is really lies in the marketplace and using the power of the marketplace to drive good agricultural practices more broadly in our world. So GLOBAL.G.A.P members create private sector incentives for agricultural producers worldwide to adopt safe and sustainable practices. A snapshot of our organization is that we are a membership-driven organization, producer members, supplier members, and all kinds of associate members that support the supply chains of these GAP certified products. There are more than 430 members currently. We have close to 200,000 certified producers at this time in over 125 countries. We work with three main, what you would refer to as a product or standard sets, but under those there are 40 and more standards in individual programs, and we touch 600 different products. So we have a broad reach and quite a bit of experience applying this, 10 years of experience applying this group certification approach. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca, who is our technical expert in the North America market, and she's going to explain how this works for GLOBAL.G.A.P.
Thank you, Roberta, and good afternoon or good morning to everyone out there today. I wanted to go over the different certification options to understand how group certification relates to GLOBAL.G.A.P terminology. Most people in the US might be familiar with certification option 1. This would be an individual producer for certification. This is the farmer having their own certificate to use in the marketplace. So the producer would apply, they would have their own certificate, and they could have one or multiple orchards or ranches or fields or blocks within that same certificate. So we are not a certification scheme that does certificates by contiguous land or by individual ranches or orchards, but we have all of the land under the same legal entity on one certificate. So that would be our option 1. As we mentioned earlier, there are ways to have a QMS within an option 1. This would be if a producer has what we call a multi-site. So 2 different versions of a multi-site would be one with a quality management system and one without. So this would be in an option 1 without implementation of a QMS. A producer has multiple production sites. They don't function as separate legal entity, and each site is audited and each site is added to the initial certificate. An example of this would be a producer that has production sites in, say, Salinas or Huron, or those are different California cities, another one in Arizona or other additional states, but all of those sites are audited and then added to a certificate and have to be comply with the same compliance criteria. With a multi-site with implementation of a QMS, say you have 12 different sites, for example, in 12 different states, and it's the same situation where those sites do not operate as separate legal entities. However, there are too many sites at harvesting at different points in the year. It becomes too complicated in order to schedule 12 different audits. So the site decides to implement a quality management system. And this would be where this QMS applies to this option 1 producer, whereas a sample of the sites would be audited. All of the sites would be listed in a certificate annex, but this makes it a little bit easier on the operation and the certification body to schedule. So you can use a QMS in option 1. But focusing today our presentation on group certification, so we call this option 2. So this is when a producer group applies as a legal entity for GLOBAL.G.A.P group certification. So the group would be the certificate holder, and the group would be operating a quality management system. So the group applicants, all of those individual producers, would all have to adhere to GLOBAL.G.A.P general regulations, but the group would be the certificate holder. This also applies for our benchmark schemes. So this would be option 3 and option 4 if you've read about those. So maybe like a Swiss GAP or a Thai GAP as a group would be something like an option 4. We do have an additional standard that we operate called the Harmonized Produce Safety Standard in collaboration with United Fresh and the G.A.P committee. This could also be under an option 2. It would not be option 3 or 4 because it is a separate standard, but it would be option 2, Harmonized Produce Safety Standard. So that would be a food safety only standard that could be done as a group as well. So a producer group, all of these are individual producers. They are all separate legal entities. They come together as a certain type of legal entity, and then they become the holder. So legal entity, typically what we see is a packing house or a co-op or some sort of group organization of growers. Could also be a marketing company, which is generally the case here in the US specifically. So that company or organization is generally responsible for placing the agricultural product onto the market. So this would be any sort of legal entity that's responsible for agricultural production or agricultural trading could be the legal entity here. I want to clarify that some other sorts of trade organizations, such as a strawberry commission or a cantaloupe cooperative, which is a more governmental lobby organization, would not qualify as a group option. This would be an organization that's responsible for helping the producers, but is not responsible for getting that product onto the market. So we have to be very careful about who can be the certificate holder, but I think those are discussions and questions we could have at an individual level. So option 2 is our group certification. The aim of the QMS, so the aim of the quality management system in a grower group, is to ensure that all producers and any of the production sites under the scope comply with the certification requirements. So the internal systems are in place to make sure that each producer or site is able to pass the certification and at any time adhering to those compliance requirements. And for auditors, by auditing the QMS and the sample of the producers, the CB's job is to assess whether the applicant or whether the group internal controls are appropriate. So the CB would do a sample in order to compare their own external sample to the group's internal control. So did the internal inspector and auditor have the same conclusions as the external auditor? And if so, great. And if not, what are we missing, and how can we determine what the group needs to do to have or improve their controls? And the idea here too, as Roberta mentioned earlier, is making sure that we're leveraging the resources of the group rather than the certification body. So in terms of auditor capacity, and in terms of, people in the group level and at the packing house and the co-op, they're more of experts of what's happening on those individual farms. They spend more time with those farmers than the external auditors who get one day with the farmers. So they should know more than anyone what the better practices would be, and also using those relationships to provide advice or any sort of improvement techniques or whatever the farmer needs in order to reach the level of compliance, and that's usually better dealt with at the group level. So I'm going to deep dive into the requirements for the QMS. By deep dive, I just mean I'm going to go over the 13 requirements of the QMS system, but I'm not going to go in specific detail. We do have a general class that we put on for CBs and inspectors for this, and we're working on having an in-depth class for the industry soon. But I'll just give you a quick snapshot of each one of the requirements. So here, the first requirement is that the applicant or the group must be a legal entity. So this is where we're talking about agriculture production and trading. There would be a legal contract between the group and the group members. So the group members say, yes, I will belong to this group, and I will commit to adhering to the GLOBAL.G.A.P practices. So this legal entity becomes the sole holder of that certificate, and the members are not legal certificate holders, so only the group can use a certificate in business-to-business transaction, not the producers from themselves. So the contract between the producers and the group also has should have some clarity around who markets the product or who brings the product to the consumer, or where the product goes next. Some interesting notes here is that the group cannot have members in different countries. So GLOBAL.G.A.P is also, part of it is adherence to legal requirements. So if there are different countries, there's going to be different legal requirements. Therefore, it would be too hard to implement the standard in 2 different countries. There are some, wiggle rooms around that with national interpretation guidelines, but generally not having members in different countries. And then Any of the products could be in this group certificate. So you could have, say, apples, cherries, and walnuts, as long as those products are going through that certificate, and all of those go through a group mass balance system. So it's not limited per product, but it could be whatever sold through that production or trading group. Moving forward, there are contracts required, so not only some sort of policy together, but the contracts. What do the contracts include? It includes all of the information about the producer or the production site. So this would be details of the area or crops, how the internal group would handle sanctions. So this would be if there's non-compliance during the internal inspection, should be corrections, and then the producers agree to say, yes, I will close if we do that. Like that would be in the contracts. The next thing would be a producer and site internal register, would be basically a list of all the information, including the status, whether or not that producer member or site is approved to be in the group, information on the growing area, the products, the acreage, etc., or tonnage if you're using this in livestock or aquaculture, inspection dates and results. So how did the producers do on the date of the inspection? Each group has a different way of handling this site internal register. Most commonly is something like an Excel spreadsheet that details all of the information. There are resources from the certification bodies to help you out with something like that. Amanda will talk about how they handle their site internal register to make it easier to keep track of who's in that group, and also making sure that that information is consistently sent to the certification body so that the group and the certificate are constantly up to date and consistent. Other things at the QMS level or group level would be the management and organization documented. So this would be making sure that internal staff or the internal auditor and internal inspector or the audit team is listed, as well as any technical advisors or contractors, for example, a farm labor contractor. There would also be documented competency requirements. So what do we expect from our internal auditor? What should their background be, etc. So that probably could be copy and pasted from the actual rules, and then making sure that it's implemented. Records of qualification and training would be kept. Key staff would be kept informed and updated of any development issues, legislative issues, or anything that's going on unique to that crop or industry. There should be an induction training or introduction training and annual refreshment training for key staff. So this is where the management commits to having suitably trained resources to be able to operate the quality management system. To be able to ensure that the requirements of GLOBAL.G.A.P are met, so that internal audits and internal inspections are carried out with authority, that the internal auditors and inspectors are able to make independent and technically justified decisions. So there's no, we need this farmer to pass, so we have to make sure that they get a good score on the internal inspection. These are the kind of rules and resources that would be in this management and organization section. And of course, this is where also an auditor externally from a certification body would double check the resumes or CVs to make sure that there's no conflict of interest between the internal inspectors and the areas that are being inspected and audited. Next would be document control procedures. This is very standard among any food safety management system, so making sure that there is some sort of quality manual. There are operating procedures for when are inspections conducted, when is the quality management system reviewed. Any work instructions are documented. There are recording forms. I want to be careful here to say that recording forms that are unique for any individual producer in the group is completely fine. So for example, maybe a requirement is that every producer has to have some sort of pesticide records because it is required in the GLOBAL.G.A.P checklist. However, if one farmer uses an Excel sheet and another producer uses a calendar and another producer uses a software system, that's fine because they can have different recording systems. But if there's a specific recording form required by the QMS, then each farmer is required to use it. So being careful here about what is dictated by the QMS and what is flexible for the producers to be able to handle at their farm sites. Then making sure that records are kept for a minimum of 2 years. Of course, online or electronic records are valid. Being careful here about how things are being able to be backed up. There has to be some sort of backup for the QMS to be able to operate at any single time. All of these records and documents need to be detailed enough to demonstrate compliance. They need to be available to the relevant staff and producer group. Documents and the document policy needs to be reviewed periodically. This question usually can't be checked until the whole assessment of the group and the producer assessments are also conducted, because we want to make sure that all of the producers have access to these documents, and that all of the documents at the farm level are the controlled and most up-to-date copy. So that would be like obsolete documents are effectively rescinded, for example. For complaints, there must be a documented procedure, how complaints are received, registered, identified, and followed up and reviewed. This needs to be available to customers, but also be available to the individual producers as well. So a complaint can be against the applicant, meaning the group, or complaint against individual producers or sites. So this complaint system, depending on the technical level of the business, could be held at the QMS, but at the level of the farm, that whatever is relevant to the farm, it must be available to the producer members. So certain sorts of food safety aspects of a complaint from a customer, say at beyond the grocery store level, if a complaint comes from like a normal end user consumer, maybe those complaints are handled by the marketing company and then by the packing house, and the packing house determines whether the farm is implicated or not, and then depending on that situation, maybe the farm needs to have their own complaint procedures as well, but it just depends on the procedures of the group. But the relevant part of the complaint system should be available to the producer members. There's an internal audit of the QMS. So this is the internal auditor auditing the QMS, making sure that they complete the QMS checklist, the same checklist that the external audit completes. There would be requirements to fill in each control point, because each one of these is going to be reviewed by the auditor during the external audit. Here would be, during any sort of internal audit, there would be non-compliances generally, especially if you have to update documents anyway. And there's a difference between corrections and corrective actions, right? So immediately solving the problem versus having a root cause analysis to determine why that happened, and then really diving in to try and fix that internal problem. So this is just saying that we need to have an internal audit. We need to record these audit findings and having follow-up corrective actions from these audits. Then there's internal producer and production site inspection. So this is where you have the internal inspector doing inspections for each registered producer annually. Then there could be new members added or new production sites added during the year. These should be inspected before being registered with the group or with the certification body. All of these inspection reports are reviewed by the internal auditor. So the internal auditor would be signing off and actually making sure that the inspection reports were completed adequately, and then saying whether or not that producer can be added to the internal register. This can be done on a consistent 12-month schedule. So maybe the first year of certification, the internal inspections are done a little bit before harvest or right at harvest in order to make sure that the internal inspections include harvest. But after that, knowing the criteria of GLOBAL.G.A.P and when inspections can be done, those inspections can be done during agronomic activities. So a group can have a better idea and set out a calendar of when inspections would be done in order to spread out their time and efficiency a little bit better. So making sure that understanding there's flexibility in the timing of those inspections. Just more information about the inspection report. It would be like any sort of farm report that is provided for option 1. So it would be information about the farm, date and duration of the inspection, right? Because those same information or the same rules apply to as external, and information about the evaluation result against the global gap control point. So here we have the internal inspectors having the same compliance requirements as external farms. Moving on, the group must have information about non-compliances and corrective actions. So there's documented procedures about how corrective actions are evaluated. So does it adequately satisfy that non-compliance, and a time scale. So this would generally be not less than 28 days, but always no time is given for compliance where a serious threat to the safety of the people, the environment, or the consumer is present. So there have been times where me as a former auditor from a certification body has said, you need to fix this corrective action, you need to fix this non-compliance before I leave the farm today, something like that, where it poses a serious threat. So that should be in those policies, as well as going back to the information about the management system and the managers allowing the internal inspectors and auditors to have that authority to do that. Responsibility should be defined. Who's responsible? Is it the internal inspector or is it the producer themselves? And the group is allowed to suspend or cancel registered producers. Like if that producer might hold back the certification of the whole group, then maybe they should be suspended, have that notification to the CB, and protect themselves if the producer is not able to comply with the requirements. There should be a product traceability documented procedure. This would include a mass balance exercise per product. So what that means, mass balance, is that product that came in as certified, went out as certified, product that is sold as non-certified came in as non-certified. So just making sure that there's clear traceability through the entire process for that kind of thing. This would be able to be done at a packing house level, but whatever is relevant to the farm in terms of traceability also needs to be included, and it needs to be carried out at the farm. So if the producer is responsible for harvest records and bin tickets or whatever that is, then they would be responsible for that and have that on the farm. Similarly, with withdrawal of products, so the group would have documented procedures to manage the withdrawal. They would test that out annually. So whether that is a full mock recall or a traceback exercise depends on your terminology, but also how far that group is responsible. This means that the individual producers may not have to be in that mock recall. So not every 200 producers of a 200 producer group needs to do a traceback, but at the group level, each producer needs to know their responsibility of that traceback and have that part of that procedure available at that farm. So this would be just making sure we know the events, types of events, the person's responsible for making decisions, whether you withdraw or notify customers. This also includes notification of the CB, and how would you get that product back if you had to get it back. In terms of subcontractors, sometimes a packing house is responsible for the harvest of that product. So maybe the QMS then is responsible for developing the subcontractor assessments and making sure that those subcontractors meet those requirements. So these would be, first of all, agreements and service contracts, but also coming up with some sort of checklist or assessment in order to check all of those subcontractors. Amanda could talk a little bit more about how they look at farm labor contractors for the group instead of individually at each individual farm, which can save much more time in terms of trying to prepare for the audit if it's done at a QMS level. There's the ability to add new producers or new sites during the certificate cycle. They can add up to 10 producers without incurring new external inspections. There's rules. If you add more than 10%, you would have to do the square root of the new added producers, et cetera, but it is possible in order to have producers be added during the certificate. Of course, they would have to pass internal inspections and be reviewed internally before being added to the certificate. There's rules around the logo use, whether or not you can use a GGN or the logo. Those would be the exact same as they are in our normal GLOBAL.G.A.P system for option 1. Of course, the logo doesn't appear on the final product. You can use a GGN, and there are specific rules around that. And here we have example of the QR code that can be on products. And we're encouraging you to look up the QR logo and determine if that is something that is necessary for your business. There are different requirements for the internal auditor and inspector. I won't go super in depth in these. The qualifications have a mix of education and experience. For example, post-high school diploma and with 2 years experience in crops, for example, or an ag high school qualification with additional years of experience. This person must also have quality management system experience. So whether that's practical knowledge or a day-to-day, or also attending an internal auditor training course. So specific educational requirements. They of course have to have training in HACCP and food hygiene. And this example here is for crops. So plant protection, fertilizer, and IPM training would be specific to crops. But if there was a livestock group or an aquaculture group, then there would be separate scope-specific requirements. So this is the internal auditor. They're the one responsible for auditing the quality management system and approving the members based upon the inspection reports. Then you have the internal inspector, who is responsible for the inspections of farm. Again, qualifications require a mix of education and experience. So this is, again, post-high school diploma and something related to agriculture or crops, depending on which group scope that they're in. 1 day practical inspection course, observing 2 CB inspections or internal inspections. So they have to do a witness inspection as well as have a successful shadow. So they need to be able to inspect and be able to carry out those inspections in order to be qualified for this. Of course, the inspector and auditor need to be independent and have not being able to audit their own job, and they need to maintain confidentiality. So even as they go from producer to producer, they should not be sharing confidential information from farm to farm. A little bit about the assessment process. So it looks basically like this. You have an internal audit of the QMS. This is done by the internal auditor, and then there are internal inspections that are conducted by the internal inspector as well. You have an external audit of the QMS, as well as external inspections of a sample of the producers. For those of you that would like that in writing, it's the same exact thing. So you have the internal audit and then the initial site inspections. Every year for the internal audit and internal inspection, it is the same. So all of the QMS and all of the producers would be evaluated by the internal system. For the certification bodies, there are different ways to do it as well. So you have a first visit, which is a review of the QMS and a square root of the producers and the central product handling units. And then you have a second visit. So this would be coming back to the farm and doing a surveillance inspection, 50% square root of the certified production producers. So this would be sometime after 30 days and before the 30 days of the expiration. This certification body comes back. They give the group 48 hours notice of who they're going to come visit. So that means all of the producers need to be complying with GLOBAL.G.A.P at all times. And then they do half of the square root of the production sites. So it is a continuous all year sort of system that needs to be capable of operating at any time. There are different rules around how many nonconformances are detected during the previous year, but no less than the square root of the actual number of registered producers would be audited externally by the certification body at any time. So as an example, you have 50 members. The QMS is audited every year. There would be 8 growers inspected during the initial audit, 4 growers expected during the surveillance. So you could say growers, producers, farmers, however you term that. Year 2, if there were no nonconformances for year 1, there would be 4 announced inspections the first visit, and then the second visit would be 4. But still, 8 total inspections, which would be still the square root, no less than the square root. A QMS audit generally takes a minimum of 6 to 8 hours, depending on the size and complexity. I mean, we have one group that has 4,000 members in Italy that obviously takes more than 6 to 8 hours. So being flexible to the timing and understanding the operations that are being audited. There are differences between structural and non-structural audits. So in some cases, if there are multiple findings at different farms as the external auditor goes along, it may be an issue with the training of the internal inspector rather than an issue happening at each farm. So then the group would be responsible for implementing that corrective action at every single farm. However, if it's one individual producer that has one issue and it's not seen again in the entire audit, then maybe that is just a non-structural non-compliance that only that farm has to fix. And again, there are different variations of these as it goes along. The QMS may also manage a residue monitoring system, or RMS, for the registered products. So this means the residue for pesticides can be, residue monitoring for pesticides can be handled at the group level rather than the individual farmer level, and there are different rules about that. The information about the audit report from the certification body is listed here, so it's very specific how the audit report should be turned out. There's a specific certificate that is given out for the option 2 as well, where it includes the annex for all of the producer group members. You can see here where it has the producer name and address, the products, etc., etc. So this would be able to be given to retailers or purchasers, so that way you can show that your farms are certified through option 2. And then there's information about maintenance on how we, after your first year of certification, making sure that you're aware there's QMS unannounced audits. This is not of the producers again because they're audited in the surveillance inspections, but certification bodies must have 10% of QMS audits selected, so there's a possibility for an additional QMS audit. Burden of proof, meaning keeping your certification requirements up all year and having information or records available about any of your activities just in case something happens, and then making sure you're keeping your schedule for the rotation of internal inspections, etc. So with that, that's a pretty high-level overview of the option 2 requirements, or QMS requirements, and I want to turn it over to Amanda to talk a little bit about Wonderful Citrus and how they operate the option 2 system for themselves. Amanda?
Thanks, Rebecca. Hello, everybody. Let me share with you a little bit why we decided to go with option 2 and over option 1 or another audit scheme. There was a much more widely accepted and much more interactive process with our buyers whenever we have been able to provide a GLOBAL.G.A.P certification. Another reason that we decided to go with option 2 was for the ranch grouping process. When you go with GLOBAL.G.A.P, it is requiring that you are grouping with under the same management. So we were able to group more ranches into one group and not having to worry if they were literally adjacent to each other. Another option that really kind of took it over the top for us was the off-site desk option. What that includes is us providing all of our documentation, which could be the QMS manual, our internal inspections, any of the required documents that a CB will be doing an inspection on, forwarding it over to our selected auditor within 2 weeks prior to the on-site for them to look at all of the documentation and then reply back to us letting us know if they have any questions or need additional documentation. Of course, that saved us quite a bit of time when we can do the off-site or the desk audit rather than having them on-site and having the pressure of trying to find the documents all at once. If there were any additional documents that we needed to provide, we put them in a Dropbox that at the end of the audit, when it was over, we took away the access for the auditor to look at those documents. So our operation currently includes, give or take, 50 growers. Those are outside growers, which is not owned and not managed by Wonderful Citrus. We do have approximately 50,000 acres with our owned properties, managed properties, and outside growers. And we also have farm labor contractors. So as Rebecca was talking about a little bit earlier, was the QMS personnel that you have to have in order to make the option to work for you. We have on staff a QMS manager, 2 QMS auditors, and 2 QMS inspectors. And whenever you have to have your QMS manual audited, we utilize somebody at one of our alternate locations outside of California to audit our QMS manual, and vice versa whenever they need to have their manual audited. When it comes to the QMS auditor and the QMS inspector, we have a QMS auditor, myself, for the owned and managed ranches. Pardon me, I'm the QMS inspector. And then we have another person who is responsible for third-party growers and the farm labor contractors, who then comes in and audits my work. It's just flip it, and we do the exact opposite roles for each other's operations. So I am in turn the QMS auditor for the farm labor contractors and the outside growers, as that person is the QMS inspector. It helps because we work closely together. We know how our operations work, although you do have the option, if you need to use an outside source in order to get that completed and make sure you're compliant with the QMS, you do have that option. So, and I apologize for it being a little hard to see, but I took a snapshot of a sample of what we're using for the register. And we keep this up to date annually. It includes if we are adding, changing, or keeping a specific grower on our register. It includes the ranch name, entity, contact, and so on. The things that I think are important for you to note on here is the column just before it starts to list all of the commodities is the scheduled date of the internal inspection. So we have quite a few areas to be inspecting, and our audits generally happen in November, which we may not have every internal inspection completed for the year by the time the audit comes around. However, our register is showing that we are going to be completing it in a specific date. So it's on a schedule and we know it's going to happen, and that's what we provide to our auditor. Next slide, please. We use a web-based QMS recording system. We've created our own internal inspections so that, one, it's recorded electronically, easy to find, easy to file. It also tracks if there's any non-compliances or corrective actions that need to be completed. So some of the requirements that GLOBAL.G.A.P wants to see on here that we've included are the total percentage of your minor must, pardon me, and major must, your start and end time, commodity, the acres, any additional notes. We also list out each question by their number, and we'll answer yes, no, not applicable, and attach any documentation that relates to that question. We can also add any notes the auditors see. And when these forms are complete, then we give access to our auditor for the desk audit, and they can review every internal inspection. They can see when they were completed, any of the non-compliances and so on. To GLOBAL.G.A.P option 2, we're trying to understand where GLOBAL.G.A.P was thinking or how they were thinking about each question. Found that it was more ISO based. It wasn't, here is your question, here is what exactly we're looking for. It was more of, you're finding your solution and you're letting the auditor, the CB know, this is how our operation runs and this is why it works for us, and this is how we've evaluated all of our risks. So it's very much risk-based. You have a lot of risk analysis to complete and continue to use throughout the year. And there was a lot of other areas that were involved that I didn't, environmental issues, financial, worker health and safety. It's more encompassing audit scheme. We, during our first audit, it's not required that you have a QMS internal auditor. And so finding the internal staff, finding the right people that understood what we were looking at, how to do the risk analysis, and was probably one of our biggest challenges. And also then making sure that because we have to do more of these internal inspections, how are we going to handle that? Do we need to hire more people? Can our staff that we currently have do it? So it was definitely a balance between all of that. And the initial setup of the quality management system was intense, to say the least. And we actually, to make sure that we were understanding each question and the compliance criteria the way it should be understood, we had a initial inspection. It's just an assessment so that we could get feedback on how we're doing, were we understanding the requirements correctly, the documentation that we have, would it suffice, which we found to be really helpful. So the biggest benefit by far for us was the time benefit and the time that we essentially got back. So when we compared it to option 2, we found that we would have the 2 weeks prior to the audit with the desk audit, where you weren't necessarily sitting down for a whole week at a time or a few days at a time. The auditor was looking at the documentation and then contacting you and letting you know if they have questions or needed further clarification. And then on site for those 50,000 acres, or I should say the square root of the total acreage that we have, totals approximately 1 week on site. Big difference, less than half the time, and definitely then equals half the cost. You don't have your auditor there as long, having to pay for transportation for them and place to stay, and also the pressure of having an auditor on site for 6 weeks is pretty intense. The cost for our ongoing staff and our maintenance is minimal because we're doing it in a paperless fashion, and find that we're just paying for that service. We're not having to print out a whole lot of documentation, and it's much easier to manage. So that's where we're at. That's how we got to decide to move over to option 2. I think it's one of the best options that we could have chosen in terms of an audit scheme. So with that, I will turn it over.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much for that very insightful presentation. And I would just like to invite our audience to send in any questions they may have for our Q&A session, which we're going to start right now. And we actually have quite a few questions that have already asked, and all of our speakers will be able to participate in this Q&A session. So let me get started with this first question that we've had sent in from the audience. And that question is, how does GLOBAL.G.A.P know that group certification is as effective as individual certification for providing assurance?
Thanks, Tegan. This is Roberta. I can quickly answer that. I know we're keeping an eye on time and want to be able to, let's try to answer some of the general questions first, and then if there are technical questions that people have, perhaps we can get in touch with them individually after this. Regarding how do we know that this is working, basically, that is the charge of our integrity program. So GLOBAL.Ga.P has a whole department with a VP level position and a team of people that manages what's called the integrity of the system. And the option 2 is a huge part of that, given how many growers we have under option 2 and group certification. So in their process, they will evaluate every year the performance of the CBs by looking at the CBs and also sampling producers. And so in that process, we've been able to determine that the performance of producers, whether they're in a group or individual certification, is essentially the same. So that's a very encouraging result for us over and over. We look at that annually, and you can see more details in our integrity report online.
Perfect. Thank you, Roberta. And we have another question from the audience here. And that question is, can groups be certified under GLOBAL.Ga.P's Harmonized Produce Safety Standard, the standard that mirrors the USDA's H.G.A.P standard?
Rebecca, do you want to take that since you actually mentioned that already?
Yeah, the producers can be certified as a group under HPSS, or Harmonized Produce Safety Standard. So each producer would be complying with the HPSS. All of the QMS rules would be tailored to the HPSS, and then that would be carried out as a normal option 2. And again, they can be groups for other benchmark schemes. So making sure that we can audit to the option 2 for HPSS.
Wonderful. And this looks like it might be our final question for our question and answer period in the interest of time. And that question is, can a standard utilizing group certification be recognized by Global Food Safety Initiative?
This is Roberta. Yes, GLOBAL.Ga.P's Integrated Farm Assurance Standard and its Harmonized Produce Safety Standard, and those are both GFSI recognized standards, and we go through that process for re-benchmarking those as necessary. So yes, that is possible.
Wonderful.
Rebecca, did you want to add anything to that?
No, that's great.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for all of those answers. We have reached the end of our Q&A period, and if we weren't able to attend to your questions this webinar, the team at GLOBAL.Ga.P may try to follow up with you after the webinar. If you have any further questions, please direct them to the email address showing on your screen. Thank you everyone for participating in today's conference. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. You can share the webinar on LinkedIn. Thanks again so much to our speakers, Roberta, Rebecca, and Amanda. We hope you found this conference informative. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.